Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I remember the exact moment my son told me he was going to be a father. We were standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd once done his homework at the table and asked me to check for monsters under his bed. He smiled in that boyish way he's always had, even as a grown man, and said, "Mom, you're going to be a grandma." I hugged him so tightly I thought he might laugh and tell me to breathe. My heart swelled with pride, gratitude, and relief. After everything he'd been through, after the struggles of early marriage and financial stress, this felt like a blessing we all needed. I didn't question a thing that day. I didn't look for cracks. I simply trusted. That was my first mistake. His wife, Melissa, had always been polite with me, but distant in a way I couldn't quite explain. She smiled when she needed to, spoke softly, and kept conversations short. I told myself that not everyone shows affection the same way. When my son married her, I made a promise to myself to stay in my lane, to be supportive but not intrusive. I knew too many mothers who lost their sons by pushing too hard. I didn't want to be one of them. So when he announced the pregnancy, I congratulated her warmly, brought over a basket of vitamins and baby clothes, and tried to be excited enough for all of us. Still, there were small things that unsettled me. Melissa avoided eye contact when the pregnancy came up. She declined my offer to go to doctor's appointments together. She said she wanted to keep things low stress. I respected that, even when it hurt a little. I told myself this wasn't about me, it was about them, about their future, about the baby. Weeks passed and I noticed my son growing quieter. He used to call me every Sunday evening, without fail. Now days would slip by. When we did talk, his voice sounded tired, distracted, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't name. One evening I asked him gently if everything was okay. He said yes too quickly. Mothers know that tone. It's the sound of someone lying to protect themselves, or someone else. The first real crack appeared at a family dinner. Melissa mentioned how far along she was, casually, as if she'd said it 100 times before. I froze for just a second. The number didn't match the timeline I remembered from my son's announcement. I didn't say anything. I smiled, nodded, and passed the salt. But inside, my mind was racing. I went home that night and sat alone in the dark, replaying conversations, counting weeks on my fingers like I used to when I balanced my checkbook. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. I tried to push the thoughts away. Doubt is a dangerous thing, especially when it involves the people you love most. But doubt has a way of growing when it's ignored. Over the next few weeks, the inconsistencies multiplied. Stories changed. Dates shifted. Melissa grew more defensive. And my son, my sweet, honest son, looked more and more like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, afraid to look down. One afternoon, he showed up at my house unexpectedly. His eyes were red, his shoulders slumped. He didn't sit down right away. He paced my living room like he used to when he was nervous before exams. I asked him what was wrong, and he said nothing at first, just shook his head. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked me something I never expected to hear. He asked me if I thought a baby could come early, really early. My heart dropped into my stomach. I told him the truth as gently as I could. Sometimes they do, but not the way he was describing. He sat down then, put his hands in his hands, and in that moment I knew. I didn't know all the details, but I knew the truth was closer than he wanted to admit. As a mother, every instinct screamed at me to protect him, to shield him from pain, even if it meant pretending not to see what was right in front of us. But another part of me, the part that raised him to value honesty above comfort, knew I couldn't lie. Not to him. Not now. I asked him if he had doubts. He nodded, slowly. Tears slipped down his face, and I felt my own eyes burn. He said Melissa had been distant before the pregnancy, that there were nights she didn't come home, excuses that never quite added up. He said he wanted to believe the baby was his, because believing felt easier than facing the alternative. I held his hand like I used to when he scraped his knees as a child. I didn't give advice, I didn't accuse, I just listened. That night after he left, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, staring at the wall. I knew what was coming, and I hated myself for knowing. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed the numbers would somehow work themselves out. But deep down, I understood that truth has a way of surfacing, whether we invite it or not. The days that followed were tense and quiet. My son stopped calling again. When I reached out, he said he needed time. I respected that, even though it hurt. I watched from the sidelines as their marriage strained under the weight of unspoken questions. I didn't interfere. I didn't investigate. I simply waited, because sometimes waiting is the hardest thing a mother can do. Then came the phone call that confirmed everything. My son called me late one night, his voice breaking. He told me the truth had finally come out. The baby wasn't his. The room seemed to spin as he spoke. I closed my eyes and listened, my heart shattering, not from surprise, but from the sound of his pain. He said Melissa admitted everything when he confronted her with the dates. He said she cried, begged, apologized. He didn't know what to do. In that moment, I realized this story was no longer about betrayal alone. It was about choice, about dignity, about what it means to love someone enough to tell them the truth, even when it hurts. I told my son I was proud of him for asking questions, for trusting his instincts. I told him whatever he decided, I would stand by him, and I meant it. What I didn't know then was how deep the consequences would go, or how much this truth would reshape our family. I didn't know the road ahead would force all of us to confront who we really were. But that night marked the end of innocence, and the beginning of something far more difficult and far more honest.
The morning after that phone call, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that wouldn't lift. I moved through my house on autopilot, making coffee I barely tasted, staring out the window at a street that looked exactly the same, even though my world felt completely altered. As a mother, you never stop worrying about your child, no matter how old they are. But this was different. This wasn't about scraped knees or bad grades. This was about betrayal so deep it could rewrite a person's sense of self. And I knew my son was standing right in the middle of it, trying not to drown. He came over later that day. He looked older somehow, like the night had carved new lines into his face. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd told me I was going to be a grandmother, and stared at his hands. I didn't rush him. Silence can be a gift when someone is gathering the courage to speak. Finally, he told me everything. How he confronted Melissa calmly at first, how she denied it, how he laid out the dates one by one until there was nowhere left for her to hide. He said the truth came out in pieces, each one hurting more than the last. The baby wasn't his. The affair hadn't been a one-time mistake. It had been ongoing, careless, hidden behind lies he never thought she was capable of. As he spoke, I felt anger rise in me, hot and sharp. Not just anger at Melissa, but anger at myself for not trusting my instincts sooner, for smiling through my doubts because I didn't want to be that mother. But I kept my voice steady. This wasn't about my feelings, it was about his. He asked me what he should do. That question broke my heart more than anything else, because it meant he was still trying to put others first, even now. I told him the truth, gently but clearly. I told him no one deserved to be trapped in a lie, especially one that would follow him for the rest of his life. I told him that loving someone didn't mean sacrificing his dignity or his future. I reminded him that whatever choice he made needed to be one he could live with when he was alone at night. He nodded, tears spilling freely now. I held him, my grown son, and wished with everything in me that I could take his pain away. Melissa didn't reach out to me at first. Days passed, then a week. When she finally did, it was a long message filled with apologies, explanations, and justifications. She said she was scared. She said she didn't want to lose her family. She said she hoped I would convince my son to forgive her. Reading her words, I felt a mix of sadness and resolve. I understood fear. I understood regret. But I also understood responsibility. I didn't reply right away. I needed to be careful. Anything I said could be used to pressure my son, and I refused to be a weapon in someone else's manipulation. When I did respond, it was kept simple. I told her I was sorry for the pain everyone was going through. I told her my priority was my son's well-being, and I told her that whatever happened next needed to be built on honesty, not desperation. She didn't reply after that. In a strange way, her silence said everything. The situation didn't stay private for long. Family secrets rarely do. Words spread quietly at first, then all at once. Whispers at gatherings, awkward pauses, people choosing sides without knowing the full story. I watched my son navigate judgment and sympathy at the same time, and I admired his strength even as I worried about him. He moved out temporarily, staying with a friend while he figured out his next steps. The house that was supposed to be filled with baby plans and laughter became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. One evening, he called me and said he'd made a decision. His voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. He said he couldn't stay in the marriage. He said he wanted to support the child emotionally, if possible, but he couldn't build his life on a lie. I felt a complicated mix of relief and grief. Relief that he chose himself, grief for the future that would never happen. Both feelings existed at once, and I learned that night that the heart can hold more than one truth. The separation was messy. Emotions ran high. There were tears, accusations, and moments when my son almost gave in, almost convinced himself that staying would be easier than leaving. Each time, I reminded him of who he was, not by lecturing, but by listening, by being present, by loving him without conditions. Melissa tried to pull me into their conflict more than once, asking me to speak to him to soften his resolution. I refused. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect. This was his journey, not mine to control. As weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. My son began to heal, slowly, unevenly, but genuinely. He started going to therapy, he picked up old hobbies, he laughed again. Not the forced kind, but the kind that comes from a place of real relief. Watching him rebuild himself was painful and beautiful all at once. It reminded me that endings, no matter how brutal, can also be beginnings. People asked me how I felt about the baby. That question caught me off guard. I told them the truth. I felt compassion. The child was innocent in all of this. I also felt sadness because I knew my role in that child's life would never be what I had imagined. But I refused to let bitterness take root. Life had already taken enough from all of us. One afternoon, months later, my son and I sat together on my porch watching the sunset. He told me he was grateful that I didn't dismiss his doubts, grateful that I didn't pressure him to stay for appearances, grateful that I trusted him to make his own choices. Hearing that was my closure, not because the story had a neat ending, but because it had honesty. Looking back, I realized this wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a story about motherhood, about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, about loving without controlling, about understanding that protecting your child doesn't always mean shielding them from pain. It sometimes means walking beside them through it. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's this. Truth hurts, but lies destroy. And as a mother, the greatest gift I could give my son wasn't answers or solutions. It was the space to face the truth and the assurance that he would never face it alone.
The months that followed were quieter on the surface, but inside me, everything was still moving. I thought once my son made his decision, once the shock settled, life would slowly return to something familiar. Instead, I found myself facing emotions I hadn't expected. Guilt, doubt, and an aching sense of responsibility that came simply from being his mother. Late at night, I replayed memories in my head, searching for signs I might have missed, moments when I could have spoken up sooner or asked harder questions. Motherhood has a way of convincing you that every outcome is somehow your fault. My son finalized the separation not long after. Papers were signed, lawyers spoke in calm, detached voices that didn't match the weight of what was being dismantled. A marriage that once felt full of promise was reduced to documents and legal terms. I went with him one afternoon when he packed the last of his things from the house. Walking through those rooms felt surreal. I remembered sitting there during holidays, watching him and Melissa laugh on the couch, dreaming aloud about the family they would build. The silence now felt almost accusatory, as if the walls themselves were asking how everything had gone so wrong. Melissa wasn't there that day. Part of me was relieved, part of me unsettled. I didn't know what I would say to her if she were. Anger still lived in me, but it had softened around the edges, turning into something closer to sadness. I realized then that holding on to rage was exhausting. It kept me stuck in the moment of betrayal, replaying it again and again. Letting go didn't mean excusing what she'd done. It meant choosing peace over punishment, for my own sake and for my son's. After the separation, my relationship with my son changed in subtle ways. We talked more, not just about the situation, but about life, fears, regrets, and hopes he hadn't voiced before. Pain has a strange way of opening doors you didn't even know were closed. He admitted he felt embarrassed, like he'd failed somehow. I reminded him that being deceived was not the same as being weak. Trusting someone is not a flaw, it's a risk we take because we believe in love. There were moments when he struggled deeply, nights when he called me because sleep wouldn't come, when his mind wouldn't stop replaying conversations, lies, and half-truths. I listened. Sometimes that was all I could do. I learned that advice isn't always helpful in moments like those. Presence is. Letting someone know they're not alone in their thoughts can be more powerful than any solution. As for me, I had to confront my own identity outside of being the fixer, the protector. I realized how often I had defined my worth by how much I could manage or control. This experience forced me to step back and trust my son's resilience. Watching him rebuild his life, piece by piece, taught me that strength doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet consistency, getting up every day, choosing healing even when bitterness feels easier. The pregnancy moved forward without us being involved. That was a boundary my son set, and I respected it. Still, I thought about that child often. I prayed for them, even though I didn't know what role, if any, I would ever play in their life. It was a strange kind of grief, mourning a relationship that never truly existed, a future that vanished before it could form. I learned that grief doesn't always come from loss of what was, but from loss of what could have been. Friends and relatives offered their opinions freely. Some thought my son was too harsh, others believed he should have stayed for the sake of stability. I learned quickly whose voices mattered and whose didn't. Everyone speaks from their own fears. Not everyone understands the cost of living a lie. I defended my son when necessary, but mostly I let the noise fade into the background. This was not a story for public judgment. It was a deeply personal reckoning. Slowly, signs of renewal appeared. My son moved into his own place. He painted the walls, something he'd never cared about before. He said choosing colors made him feel like he was finally shaping his own space, his own future. I smiled when he told me that. It was such a small thing, yet it meant everything. It meant he was reclaiming himself. One day, he told me he no longer felt angry all the time, that the sharp edge inside him had dulled. He said he didn't forgive what happened, but he accepted it. Acceptance, I learned, is often misunderstood. It's not approval, it's acknowledgement. It's saying, this happened and I survived. Hearing that from him felt like a milestone, one I dared not to hope for so soon. I also changed. I became gentler with myself. I stopped assuming that love had to come with sacrifice or silence. I learned that boundaries are not walls. They are doors that only open for those who respect you. This experience reshaped my understanding of family, loyalty, and trust. It taught me that even the people closest to us can hurt us deeply, and that healing doesn't come from denial, but from facing the truth head on. Looking back, I see now that this story wasn't just about my son's marriage or a betrayal involving a child. It was about growth, about learning to let go of the illusion of control, about understanding that motherhood is not about steering every outcome, but about standing firm when the storm hits, offering a steady place to land. There are still moments when sadness sneaks up on me, certain songs, certain dates, but they no longer knock the wind out of me.
They remind me of how far we've come. My son is not the same man he was before, and neither am I. In many ways, we're stronger, more honest, more grounded. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. Life doesn't always unfold the way we imagine, even when our intentions are pure. But truth, no matter how painful, clears a path forward. And love, real love, doesn't trap you in lies. It walks with you through the truth, no matter how hard that journey may be.
Time didn't erase what happened, but it did soften the sharpest edges of it. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm I hadn't planned for, but was learning to accept. I found myself noticing small things again, the way the morning light fell across my kitchen table, the comfort of routine, the quiet satisfaction of making dinner just for myself. After so much emotional upheaval, ordinary moments began to feel like blessings instead of background noise. My son started visiting more often. Sometimes he'd come just to sit, not to talk much, just to exist in a space where he didn't have to explain himself. I understood that need. There were evenings when we shared a meal in near silence, broken only by the clink of silverware or a passing comment about the weather. And yet those moments felt full of unspoken understanding, of shared healing. Pain has a way of deepening connections when it's met with patience instead of pressure. One afternoon, he surprised me by bringing up the baby. He hadn't mentioned the pregnancy in weeks, and I never pushed. He told me the child had been born healthy, a little girl. His voice didn't crack, but I could hear the weight behind his words. He said he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the truth had come out before he built a life on a lie, and sadness for the innocence of a child born into complicated circumstances. I listened, my heart aching in ways I couldn't fully explain. As a mother, I felt compassion for that baby, even if my role in her life would be distant or non-existent. He admitted something else that day, that for a long time he'd blamed himself. He questioned his judgment, his worth, even his ability to love again. I reached across the table and took his hand, reminding him that betrayal changes the way you see the world, but it doesn't define your value in it. I told him that loving again wasn't a weakness, but a courage that would come back when he was ready, not on anyone else's timeline, but his own. As for me, I began to reflect deeply on my own journey as a mother. I realized how often I had equated protection with control. I thought loving my child meant shielding him from every possible hurt, guiding every decision. This experience forced me to confront a hard truth. I could offer wisdom, support, and love, but I couldn't live his life for him. And maybe I was never meant to. Letting go didn't mean loving less, it meant trusting more. There were moments when old instincts flared, times when I wanted to intervene, to fix, to demand answers from people who no longer mattered. But I learned to pause, to ask myself whether my actions were rooted in love or fear. That question changed everything. Fear had driven much of my past behavior, fear of loss, fear of irrelevance, fear of my child being hurt in ways I couldn't repair. Naming those fears gave me power over them. Social gatherings were still difficult at first. Questions came, sometimes well-meaning, sometimes intrusive. What happened? How is he doing? Is there a chance they'll reconcile? I learned to respond with grace and boundaries. Not every story needs to be told in full. Privacy, I realized, is not secrecy, it's self-respect, and I owed that to myself and to my son. Slowly, I noticed changes in him that made me proud in quiet ways. He laughed more easily, he started exercising again, reconnecting with friends he'd neglected during the marriage. He spoke about future plans without hesitation. Nothing extravagant, just ideas, possibilities. That was enough. Hope doesn't need to be loud to be real. One evening, he thanked me, not in a dramatic way, but sincerely. He said having me there, steady and present, had made all the difference. that I hadn't judged him, rushed him, or tried to control his choices once the truth came out. Hearing that brought tears to my eyes. I hadn't always gotten it right, but in the moments that mattered most, I had shown up the best way I knew how. I also found healing in unexpected places: long walks, journaling, conversations with friends who listened without trying to solve anything. I began to understand that healing is not linear. Some days felt light and hopeful, others brought back old heaviness without warning. Both were part of the process. I stopped fighting the waves and learned to ride them. Looking back now, I see that this chapter of our lives reshaped us in profound ways. It stripped away illusions and forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about others, but about ourselves. It taught me that love doesn't guarantee safety, but it does provide strength, and that sometimes the most painful revelations are the ones that free us. If I could speak to any mother going through something similar, I would tell her this: you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to fix everything. Your presence, your honesty, and your willingness to grow alongside your child matter more than perfection ever could. Trust that the values you instilled will guide them even when the road takes unexpected turns. Today, our relationship is different but deeper, built not on assumptions or expectations, but on mutual respect and understanding. We survived something that could have broken us apart, and instead it brought us closer in ways I never anticipated. Life didn't give us the story we thought we'd have, but it gave us one that taught us resilience, truth, and the quiet power of unconditional love. And that, I've learned, is sometimes the greatest gift to come from the hardest chapters. As more time passed, I began to notice a change in myself that went beyond simply recovering from the shock of what had happened. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was rebuilding. There was a quiet strength growing inside me, one that came from acceptance rather than resistance. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, stopped imagining alternate endings that would never exist. Instead, I focused on what was in front of me, on who we were becoming now. My son eventually shared that he had started therapy. He didn't announce it dramatically. He mentioned it the way someone might mention a new routine, like taking morning walks or cutting back on sugar. But I knew how big that step was for him. In our family, feelings were often handled privately, quietly pushed aside. Seeing him choose healing over avoidance told me he was truly moving forward. I felt proud, not because he was doing better, but because he was taking responsibility for his own well-being. There was one afternoon when we sat on the porch together, the air warm and still. He asked me if I ever regretted the way I'd raised him. The question caught me off guard. I told him the truth, that I regretted moments, not the whole. Times when I spoke from fear instead of trust, when I tried to protect by controlling. I admitted that becoming a mother didn't come with a manual, and that I'd done the best I could with what I knew at the time. He nodded, and after a pause, he said that, despite everything, he never doubted that I loved him. That mattered more than any mistake. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that children don't need perfect parents. They need present ones. Parents who can admit when they're wrong, who are willing to grow. I had spent years thinking my role was to lead, to direct. Now I understood it was also to listen, to stand beside instead of in front. I also had to make peace with the reality that not every story ends with confrontation or apology. His wife never reached out to me. There was no dramatic confession, no moment of closure wrapped in neat words. And for a long time, that bothered me. I wanted acknowledgement, accountability. But eventually, I realized that waiting for someone else to give me peace meant giving them power over my healing. I chose to let that go. In its place, I found compassion, not approval, but understanding.
People make choices from places of fear, insecurity, and unresolved wounds. That doesn't excuse harm, but it explains it. Understanding that allowed me to release the bitterness that threatened to take root. I didn't want to carry that into the rest of my life. Family gatherings slowly returned to normal. Holidays were quieter, smaller, but more sincere. There was laughter again, not forced or fragile, but real. I learned to appreciate those moments without comparing them to the past. Comparison, I learned, is the thief of peace. What mattered was that we were together, honest and healing. One day, my son told me he was thinking about dating again. He sounded cautious, but hopeful. I didn't offer advice unless he asked. I didn't question his choices. I simply told him that he deserved honesty and respect, and that he didn't need to rush. He smiled, relieved. Sometimes support looks like restraint. As for me, I started rediscovering parts of myself I'd set aside years ago. Interests, friendships, even dreams that had nothing to do with being someone's mother. I realized that my identity had been wrapped so tightly around that role that I'd forgotten I was a whole person too. Reclaiming that didn't lessen my love for my son, it strengthened it. I was happier, more grounded, more at peace. Looking back, I see how that single moment, the day I learned the baby wasn't my son's, set off a chain of changes none of us expected. It broke something, yes, but it also revealed what was real and what wasn't. It forced growth where comfort once lived, and in the end, it brought clarity. Life doesn't always unfold the way we plan. Sometimes it arrives with truths we never wanted to face. But those truths, painful as they are, can lead us to deeper understanding, stronger boundaries, and more authentic love. I learned that being a mother isn't about holding on tightly. It's about loving deeply enough to let go when it's time. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Love rooted in trust will always outlast love rooted in fear. And when we choose patience, humility, and honesty, even the hardest betrayals can lead us somewhere unexpectedly whole.
Healing, I learned, doesn't move in a straight line. Just when I thought we had settled into a new normal, a reminder would surface, an unexpected comment, a memory triggered by a familiar place, a song on the radio, and I'd feel that old ache return. But it didn't knock the wind out of me the way it once had. It came and went like a wave instead of a storm. One evening, my son came over unannounced. He looked tired, not just physically, but in the way someone looks when they've been carrying something heavy for too long. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so many family conversations had unfolded over the years. He told me he'd finally accepted that the marriage was over in every sense, not just legally. He admitted there were moments he still blamed himself, moments when he wondered if he should have seen the truth sooner. I listened without interrupting, without rushing to fix it. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is simply bear witness. I told him something I hadn't said out loud before, that betrayal often has less to do with the person betrayed and more to do with the one who betrays, that it grows in silence, in avoidance, in fear of being honest. He nodded slowly, as if the words were settling somewhere deep. I could see relief in his eyes, the kind that comes when guilt loosens its grip, even just a little. That night after he left, I sat alone in the quiet house and reflected on how much both of us had changed. We were no longer clinging to roles we thought we had to play. He wasn't pretending to be strong all the time. I wasn't pretending to have all the answers. We were just two people learning how to move forward with grace. I also began to think about forgiveness, not as a gift for someone else, but as a choice for myself. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened. It means deciding not to let the past dictate the future.
It took time and honesty and more than a few tears, but slowly I felt my heart soften, not toward the betrayal, but toward life itself. Friends noticed the change in me. They said I seemed lighter, more present. I realized they were right. Carrying anger had been exhausting. Letting it go made room for joy again. I started saying yes to invitations, taking small trips, filling my days with things that nourished me. I laughed more. I slept better. I felt like myself again. My relationship with my son deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. We spoke more openly than ever before. There was trust between us, not based on obligation or expectation, but on mutual respect. I stopped worrying about being included in every detail of his life. Instead, I focused on being someone he could come to when he needed support, not judgment. Looking back now, I see how easily I could have let that painful chapter define me. I could have hardened, withdrawn, or insisted on being right. But choosing growth over resentment changed everything. It didn't erase what happened, but it transformed its meaning. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never asked for, sometimes through joy and sometimes through heartbreak. What matters is how we carry those lessons forward. I learned that love doesn't always look the way we expect, and family doesn't always follow the script we imagine. But when we meet change with humility and compassion, we create space for something deeper and more honest to grow. I don't know what the future holds for my son or for me, but I do know this: we are stronger than we were before, not in spite of what happened, but because we faced it together. And that, in the end, is what family truly means. The weeks that followed felt quieter on the surface, but inside me, something steady was taking root. It wasn't happiness in the loud, celebratory sense. It was calmer than that, a kind of acceptance that didn't need constant reassurance. I woke up each morning no longer bracing myself for bad news or another emotional blow. Instead, I eased into my days slowly, with intention, learning how to live without constantly replaying the past. One afternoon, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected to hear from again, my former daughter-in-law. I stared at her name on my phone for a long time before opening it. My first instinct was to ignore it. I had worked hard to reach this fragile piece, and part of me feared that one message could unravel it. But curiosity, and maybe a quiet sense of closure I didn't realize I still needed, pushed me to read her words. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer excuses. She simply acknowledged the pain she had caused and said she was sorry for involving my son, and by extension me, in a lie that had grown too large to contain. The message was short, almost careful, as if she knew she didn't deserve more space than that. I read it twice, then set the phone down and sat with my thoughts. I didn't reply right away. I wasn't sure what the right response was or if there even needed to be one. Forgiveness, I had learned, doesn't always require a conversation. Sometimes it's an internal decision, a quiet release. After a few days, I sent a brief response, wishing her clarity and honesty in whatever path she chose next. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was honest, and that felt enough. That exchange marked a turning point I hadn't anticipated. I realized I no longer needed answers from her to move on. The questions that once haunted me, how it happened, why she lied, when the truth first slipped, had lost their power. They no longer defined my days. Letting go of the need to fully understand someone else's choices freed me in ways I hadn't expected. My son, meanwhile, was slowly rebuilding his life. He took a new job, one that challenged him and gave him a sense of purpose again. He started exercising regularly, not to escape his pain, but to reconnect with his body after months of stress and sleepless nights.
Sometimes he'd call me after work, not to talk about the past, but to tell me about something small, a funny moment with a coworker, a meal he tried to cook and failed at miserably. Those calls meant more to me than he probably realized. They were proof that joy was finding its way back into his life. I also had to confront my own identity beyond being a mother. For so long, my sense of purpose had been tied to protecting my son, guiding him, worrying about him. When he was hurting, I felt it as if it were my own wound. But now, as he grew stronger, I had to ask myself who I was outside of that role. It was an uncomfortable question at first, one I avoided by keeping busy, but eventually I allowed myself to explore it. I signed up for a class I'd always wanted to take but never made time for. I reconnected with old friends I had slowly drifted away from over the years. I even started journaling again, something I hadn't done since my children were young. Putting my thoughts on paper helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before. How often I had put my own needs last, how easily I slipped into control when I felt afraid. Through that reflection, I recognized something important. My initial reaction to the betrayal hadn't just been about my son's pain, it had also been about my own fear of losing my place in his life. The secret marriage, the hidden truth, all of it had triggered a deep insecurity I hadn't wanted to admit. Understanding that didn't make me proud, but it made me honest, and honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is the foundation of real growth. As months passed, the story that once felt so heavy began to take up less space in my mind. It became something I could look at without flinching, a chapter instead of the whole book. I noticed that when people asked about my son, I no longer felt the urge to protect the narrative or gloss over the truth. I spoke simply, without bitterness. That, more than anything, told me how far I had come. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, my son thanked me in a way he never had before. He said that my steadiness during the hardest moments had given him permission to fall apart when he needed to and to rebuild at his own pace. Hearing that, I felt a quiet pride, not because I had done everything right, but because I chose love over control when it mattered most. I've come to understand that motherhood doesn't end when our children grow up. It evolves. It asks us to loosen our grip, to trust the values we've passed on, and to respect the choices they make, even when those choices lead to pain. It's not easy and is rarely acknowledged, but it's one of the most profound transformations a woman can experience. If there's one lesson I carry forward from all of this, it's that truth, no matter how painful, is always lighter than a lie. Lies fracture families, but truth, spoken or discovered, creates the possibility of healing. It doesn't guarantee reconciliation or happy endings, but it opens the door to something real. Today, my life looks different than I imagined it would at this stage, but it feels honest, and that honesty has brought me a peace I wouldn't trade for anything. I no longer define my worth by my proximity to my son's decisions or milestones. I define it by the love, patience, and humility I bring into every relationship, including the one I have with myself. And as I look toward the future, I do so without fear. Whatever comes next, I know I have the strength to face it, not as someone clinging to what was, but as someone open to what can be. As more time passed, I began to notice how differently I carried myself. The sharp edge of vigilance I used to wear like armor had softened. I no longer jumped when my phone buzzed, no longer assumed bad news was waiting on the other end. That constant state of alert had drained me for years, and I hadn't even realized how heavy it was until it was gone. Now there was space in my days, space to breathe, to think, to simply exist without bracing myself. One Sunday morning, my son came over unexpectedly. He didn't call ahead, which was unusual for him. When I opened the door and saw him standing there with a hesitant smile, something told me this visit mattered. He stepped inside, looking around as if he hadn't been in my house before, even though he'd grown up here. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he used to do his homework, where I had once scolded him for staying out too late, where so many ordinary moments had quietly shaped our lives. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about the future, about what kind of life he wanted, what kind of man he wanted to be. He admitted that the betrayal had shaken his confidence in his own judgment, and that scared him more than anything else. As a mother, every instinct in me wanted to reassure him, to tell him it would all be fine, to offer advice and solutions. But I held back. Instead, I listened. I realized then that listening, truly listening, was one of the greatest gifts I could give him. Not fixing, not guiding, just being present. When he finished speaking, there was a long pause. Then I told him something I hadn't planned to say. I told him that making a mistake didn't mean he was weak or foolish. It meant he was human, and that the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful, was something many people never find. He nodded slowly, his eyes shining in a way that told me my words had landed somewhere deep. That moment felt like a quiet restoration, not just of his confidence, but of the trust between us. It wasn't built on shared opinions or perfect outcomes. It was built on mutual respect. Later that week, I ran into an old neighbor at the grocery store. She asked about my son, her tone laced with curiosity. News travels fast in small circles, and I knew she was fishing for details. In the past, I might have deflected or felt embarrassed. This time, I answered simply. I said he was doing well, finding his footing, learning from a hard chapter. I didn't offer gossip or justification, and as we parted ways, I felt no lingering discomfort. That was another small victory I hadn't expected. At home, I reflected on how much energy I had once spent worrying about how others perceived my family. That concern had shaped so many of my reactions, pushing me toward control instead of compassion. Letting go of that need for approval felt like shedding a layer of skin. Vulnerable, yes, but also freeing. I also began to see my former daughter-in-law in a different light, not as a villain or a lesson, but as a person who made choices she couldn't undo. That perspective didn't excuse her actions, but it allowed me to release the anger I had been holding on to. Carrying resentment had never protected my son. It had only weighed me down. Setting it aside felt like reclaiming a part of myself. There was still moments when sadness surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a passing thought about the grandchild I had imagined holding one day. Grief doesn't disappear all at once. It fades unevenly, returning in waves. But I learned to let those moments pass without judgment. They were reminders of my capacity to love, not signs of weakness. As autumn arrived, my routines settled into something steady. Morning walks, quiet afternoons, evenings filled with reading or gentle music. My life wasn't dramatic or exciting, but it was grounded, and in that grounding, I found gratitude. Gratitude for resilience, for growth, for the simple fact that even broken things can mend. One evening, my son called to tell me he had started seeing someone new. He sounded cautious, as if waiting for my reaction. I took a breath before responding. I told him I was glad he was open to connection again and that I trusted his instincts. I meant it. That trust wasn't blind, it was earned through everything we had endured together. After the call ended, I sat quietly, acknowledging the mix of emotions that stirred within me. Hope, protectiveness, a hint of fear, but fear no longer ruled me. I knew that whatever happened next, I would meet it with openness rather than control. Looking back, I see how that initial revelation, the one that shattered our sense of security, forced me to confront parts of myself I had long ignored. My need to be included, my fear of irrelevance, my habit of equating love with oversight. Facing those truths was uncomfortable, but it reshaped me into someone more patient, more compassionate, and more at peace. I share this not because I have all the answers, but because I know how isolating these experiences can feel.
When family secrets surface, when trust breaks, it's easy to lose yourself in the fallout. But healing doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty, humility, and the willingness to grow alongside the people you love. If there's anything I hope others take from my story, it's this. You can't protect your children from every mistake, and you shouldn't try. What you can do is walk beside them with grace, even when the path is uneven. That kind of presence leaves a deeper mark than any advice ever could.
Winter arrived quietly that year, without drama or warning. One day the air simply felt sharper, and the light through my windows looked thinner, paler. I found myself standing at the sink one morning, watching steam rise from my coffee, thinking about how different this season felt compared to the winter before. Back then, every day it felt like survival. Now, it felt like reflection. My son began visiting more often. Sometimes we talked for hours. Other times we sat in comfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I noticed how much he'd changed. He spoke more slowly, choosing his words with care. He listened instead of rushing to fill the space. Pain had matured him in ways I wished he hadn't had to learn so early, but I couldn't deny the strength that it carved into him. One afternoon, he surprised me by asking about my own life, not about him, not about the past, but about me. He asked what I wanted now, what dreams I'd put on hold, what still brought me joy. The question caught me off guard. As mothers, we grow so used to centering everyone else that we forget we're allowed to have answers of our own. I admitted I didn't know yet, that my identity had been so wrapped around being needed that I was still learning how to simply be. He smiled gently and told me that maybe this chapter was about rediscovering myself. Hearing that from my child felt like a quiet blessing. Around that time, I began volunteering at a local community center. Nothing glamorous, just helping organize meals, listening to people who needed to talk, offering a steady presence. It grounded me. It reminded me that pain and healing exist everywhere, not just within our own families. And it gave me perspective. Everyone carries something unseen. One evening, as I was locking up after a long day, a woman stopped me to say thank you. She told me my kindness had made her feel less invisible. Her words stayed with me all the way home. I realized then that healing doesn't always come from being understood. It often comes from understanding others. My son's new relationship progressed slowly. He was cautious, transparent, almost overly careful at times. I could see the effort he was making to do things differently. He introduced me to her one afternoon over coffee. She was kind, reserved, and respectful, but what mattered most was how at ease he seemed around her. There was no performance, no tension, just calm. Afterward, he asked what I thought. I told him the truth, that I thought she seemed genuine, but more importantly, that I trusted him. That trust felt like the real milestone, more than any approval I could give. Later that night, alone in my living room, I reflected on how far we'd come. The betrayal that once felt like the end of everything had become a turning point instead. It forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, to dismantle old patterns, to rebuild with intention rather than assumption. I won't pretend there weren't moments of regret. Sometimes I wondered if I could have prevented the hurt by being more observant, more involved, more something. But I learned to release those thoughts. Responsibility doesn't always belong where we want to place it, and hindsight, while tempting, rarely brings peace. What did bring peace was acceptance. Acceptance that my son's life is his own, that love doesn't guarantee protection from pain, and that my role as a mother is not to control outcomes, but to offer steady, unconditional support. As spring approached, I felt lighter, not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped measuring happiness by absence of struggle. I had learned to value resilience, honesty, and growth.
I'd learned that family isn't defined by flawless stories, but by the willingness to stay present when stories fall apart. If you're listening to this and carrying your own family heartbreak, I want you to know something. You're not failing because things didn't go as planned. Sometimes the most meaningful connections are forged in the aftermath of disappointment. Sometimes the greatest lessons arrive disguised as loss. I never got the grandchild I once imagined from that chapter of my son's life, but I gained something else, a deeper understanding of love that doesn't demand, doesn't cling, and doesn't control, a love that stands quietly, ready when needed, and patient enough to wait. That, I've learned, is the kind of love that lasts. By the time summer returned, it felt like an entirely different lifetime from the woman I had been when my son first told me about the pregnancy. I still remembered that moment clearly, the way my heart had lifted, the way I'd already started imagining tiny socks and bedtime stories. That memory no longer hurt the way it once did. It sat quietly inside me now, like an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. Still there, still meaningful, but no longer sharp. My son called me one afternoon just to say he'd been thinking about that time too. He admitted there were days he still felt embarrassed, not just by what happened, but by how long it took him to face the truth. I told him what I truly believed, that denial is often a form of self-protection, and that forgiving ourselves is sometimes harder than forgiving others. He went quiet on the line, and then he thanked me. Not for taking his side, but for never turning away from him. That summer, we took a short trip together. Nothing extravagant, just a few days by the lake where he'd gone fishing as a boy. Watching him stand by the water again, older, steadier, I felt something settle inside me. Grief doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it just changes shape. It becomes something you can carry without it bending your spine. One evening, sitting by the fire, he asked if I was angry anymore. The question surprised me. I thought carefully before answering. I told him I wasn't angry, but that I had been disappointed in a way that forced me to look inward. I admitted there were moments when I'd blamed myself, wondering if I'd missed signs, if I'd taught him too much trust or not enough caution. He shook his head and said gently, "Mom, this wasn't your failure." Hearing that from him felt like a knot finally loosening. When we returned home, life continued in its quiet rhythm. I kept volunteering, I kept learning how to fill my days with purpose instead of worry. I stopped waiting for milestones that might never come and started appreciating the moments already in front of me. A phone call, a shared meal, an honest conversation. There was one final conversation I hadn't realized I still needed until it happened. Months after everything ended, my son's former wife reached out to me. Her message was short and cautious, asking if we could talk. I considered ignoring it. After all, what more was there to say? But something in me felt ready. We met at a small cafe. She looked different, tired, thinner, but also oddly relieved. She didn't make excuses. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply said she was sorry for the pain she caused and that she understood if I wanted nothing to do with her. I listened quietly. When it was my turn to speak, I told her the truth, that betrayal leaves scars, but accountability matters, that I hoped she would find peace, not for my sake, but for her own. When we parted, I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just closure. Walking home that day, I realized something important. Closure isn't about winning. It's about releasing yourself from the weight of unfinished emotions. It's about choosing not to let the worst chapter define the rest of your story. My son eventually told me he wanted children someday, but only when he was ready and with someone who shared his values. I smiled and told him there was no rush. Life had taught us both the cost of moving too quickly without truth. As a mother, I learned that loving your child sometimes means stepping back and trusting the lessons life will teach them. You can guide, you can support, but you can't live their life for them, and you can't protect them from every storm without also preventing their growth. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this.
Family bonds aren't broken by hard truths, they're broken by silence and denial. When we choose honesty, even when it hurts, we give ourselves a chance to rebuild something stronger. I'm no longer defined by what I lost or what never came to be. I'm defined by what I chose to do afterward. I chose compassion over bitterness, presence over control, growth over resentment. And in doing so, I found peace I never expected to find. There's a quiet kind of peace that comes only after you've walked all the way through something painful instead of turning back halfway. I didn't recognize it at first. It crept into my life slowly, in ordinary moments, watering the plants on my porch, folding laundry, hearing my son laugh again without strain in his voice. Peace didn't arrive with celebration, it arrived with acceptance. For a long time, I believed motherhood meant always being needed, advice sought, opinions asked, plans shared. When that stopped happening the way it used to, I thought it meant I was losing my place. But what I've learned now is that motherhood also means knowing when your role has changed, even if no one announces it to you, especially then. My son grew stronger in ways I couldn't have taught him. He learned discernment. He learned boundaries. He learned that love without honesty is just a fragile illusion. Watching him rebuild his life slowly, carefully, was one of the quiet triumphs of my later years, not because he did it my way, but because he did it with integrity. We don't talk much about the baby anymore, not because it's forbidden, but because it no longer defines us. Loss doesn't demand daily attention forever. Sometimes it just asks to be remembered respectfully and then allowed to rest. I've made peace with that. One evening, months later, my son surprised me with dinner. Nothing fancy, just soup he'd learned to make himself. As we ate, he told me he was grateful I didn't try to control his choices after everything fell apart. He said that restraint gave him space to heal instead of rebel. Hearing that mattered more to me than any apology ever could. I realized then that trust is not built by holding on tighter. It's built by knowing when to loosen your grip. People often ask mothers how they survive watching their children hurt. The truth is, you don't survive it by fixing everything. You survive it by staying present without becoming bitter, by loving without conditions, by allowing pain to pass through you without letting it turn you into someone you don't recognize. There were days I failed at that, days I cried alone, days I replayed conversations in my head wondering if I should have said more or less. But healing doesn't require perfection. It only requires honesty and time. If I could speak to the woman I was at the beginning of this story, the one smiling at the thought of a grandchild, unaware of the truth waiting ahead, I would tell her this: you are stronger than you think. You will be disappointed, yes, but you will not be destroyed. The love you've poured into your child will come back to you, not in the way you expect, but in the way you need. I no longer measure my life by milestones I can show others. I measure it by the peace I feel when my phone rings and it's my son calling, not because he needs something, but because he wants to talk. I measure it by the quiet confidence that I raised a good man, even if he stumbled on the way to becoming one. This story isn't about betrayal alone. It's about what comes after, about choosing dignity when you could choose anger, about allowing truth to hurt you so it doesn't poison you, about learning that being a mother doesn't end when your child becomes an adult. It simply asks you to love differently. And that, I've learned, is its own kind of grace. This is where my story ends, not with bitterness, not with blame, but with clarity, forgiveness, and a heart that finally knows how to let go without breaking.